Hello and welcome to a buildingSMART members webinar. Thank you for joining. My name is Ra Twilly and I will be your moderator today. The webinar is titled Don't Mind the Gap, GIS and openBIM Roundtable Recap from Valencia. There will be a recap from the most recent buildingSMART Summit, focusing on the exciting convergence of geographic information systems and openBIM. Marc Goldman will be presenting and also moderating the session. Marc is Director of Architecture, Engineering and Construction Industry Solutions at Esri. We also have contributions from Jag Mallela, Senior Vice President and Managing Director at WSP, and Erik Poirier, Professor at École de Technologie Supérieure. The webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour with a short Q&A at the end. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available for replay on our website. I would like to remind you that your phone lines will remain muted for the duration of this webinar. If you have any questions or wish to make comments, please use the chat function located within the control panel. I would also like to bring to your attention that buildingSMART is committed to ensuring that participation in the development of standards is unrestricted and the process for their adoption is transparent, and standards that are developed do not favor any particular provider and are open, non-binding, and accessible to all. Please take note of our antitrust code of conduct. Now I'll hand straight over to Marc.
Thank you, Ra. Thank you, buildingSMART, for an opportunity to do, like you said, a recap of some of the topics that we presented in a 90-minute session at Valencia, specifically on the intersection between GIS and openBIM. It was a very interactive session that we conducted with great feedback from the attendees, and we're going to share some of that feedback in this session. We reviewed 9 different user scenarios, use cases involving GIS and BIM and the intersection between the two. And we're going to review those here today as well and get your feedback and perspective. The purpose for doing this session and in general, the purpose for talking about the intersection between GIS and BIM is its importance is growing in the world of built structures, built projects, natural and built world industries. The need for understanding the context of a BIM-based project that GIS quite uniquely delivers is quite compelling. Within buildingSMART and OGC, there actually is a working group, which the 3 of us, myself, Jag, and Erik, are participating in, as well as many others. And we're at the point now, and we'll explain this a little bit more, that there's a roadmap, and in that roadmap, we are developing the details and validating a number of use cases. I, in particular, sit on the steering committee of the infrastructure domain in buildingSMART, and within our own roadmap, we have a GIS and openBIM thread. We have a working group around that, and we ourselves are collecting user stories from participants in that domain, as well as others who are seeking to share their perspective. And certainly the other buildingSMART domains are ramping up their GIS focus, whether it's airports or rail, buildings themselves. The importance of GIS within those contexts, within those domains, is growing, and the focus on this topic of GIS and openBIM is becoming part of their individual roadmaps and their working groups. And it's not just at buildingSMART and OGC, various other industry organizations are developing best practices around the intersection of GIS and BIM, various best practice documents, position papers, identifying what standards exist, leading towards eventually interoperability between these two contexts. I'm actually at the National Institute of Building Sciences conference in Washington, D.C. today, having just finished a session that very much was on this topic of GIS and BIM and digital twins. So it's a very important topic currently, and the interest is growing from the community, and software vendors in some cases are seeking some direction and some guidance and the user stories that this working group is developing. I alluded to a roadmap. Jag, you want to maybe jump in here and talk about the roadmap that is been developed by the working group?
Absolutely, Marc. Thank you, and greetings to everyone. I don't want to hazard myself by venturing whether it's morning or evening for you, but regardless, we're glad that you're here, and as thanks to buildingSMART, as Marc said, and certainly this group, of my co-presenters, to come together again, to actually share with you, our enthusiasm to kind of drive this roadmap forward, and also hopefully some summary level information from the Valencia summit of buildingSMART, where we actually for the first time brought different domains together to poll on what are the topics of most interest to the community in general when it comes to BIM and GIS intersection. So I think just to situate everything, it is the roadmap really that we are focused on. The roadmap that's been developed, we hope, is not a product that's on the road, that we actually start seeing implementation against the activities listed. And I'll point you to in a few slides later, where you can actually download. Now it's a published document. It's a joint publication by buildingSMART and the OGC organizations. It's available for you, and we'll share the QR code in a little bit here. But I do want to focus straight away, on some of the key activities and of the roadmap, which are laid out here. This is meant to be an action-oriented roadmap. It has a shelf life. The work of the roadmap actually just began because it just got published, which means we need to start rolling up our sleeves and actually diving into what the roadmap is recommending. The roadmap itself has been developed with a lot of input from both the buildingSMART and OGC communities. There's a lot of enthusiasm from owners who own some of the assets and infrastructure, and operators who would love to bring these two worlds together to realize and actualize use cases. The first set of activities are really to create awareness. Certainly we'll continue to build awareness around the roadmap so that we can coalesce action. The second activity is to actually start developing user stories and use cases. Actually, we kickstarted that with Valencia, which we'll share with you, and hopefully through today's session, we'll get additional ideas, from this group. So we're going to continue this outreach until we reach an audience, and I think that will continue throughout the 3-year period as we get more stories. We really don't want you to think about use cases because it's kind of a loaded term in terms of software development. But really, it's the stories. Why do we need to bring data that's hosted in these two domains, and connect them? I think it's really your story of what you see as the use, and we'll continue to explore that today, and we'll continue to explore that, going out into the future. So thank you for participating. We hope you will all participate and give us some input in that Menti poll that Marc will administer. So as we do those use cases, I think we want to then basically sort them, and look at the priority use cases, so as you share your stories, they roll up into higher order use cases, and then bigger things that the industry needs to solve together in toolkits. When I say toolkits, we need to be able to specify in our contracts as we think about information management, without really bounding ourselves to where this information is coming from, whether it's from a BIM model or a GIS model. We shouldn't care about it. It's like specifying contractually, this is the information we'd like to transmit, and we should have the industry, especially the software industry, ready to deliver it, which means we need to communicate to them, what standards apply, what data should be modeled, and what is it that we are after. So there is a little bit of work to do to aggregate the stories, prioritize them to the highest order that we can, and then start building those toolkits. That's kind of an agile approach that this roadmap is taking. While doing that, of course, there's a lot of stuff that has to happen in between. I think our first action will be, once we have the higher order use cases aggregated, call for pilots. Once we know that, okay, we're going to focus on this problem of permitting or whatever the case is, depending on the feedback, we issue calls for pilots, and hopefully we'll get funding and participation from the community, all involved, owners, users of the information, practitioners, standards development organizations, and the software industry, that we can come and collaborate to establish the tool set required to support that use case uniformly, in regions, within regions, and across everyone globally. That's the idea, is to come up with some practical use cases. Now, you might be looking at this roadmap and some of the actions that are listed here and maybe wondering, have we not been here before? Yes, We have been here before and we continue to be here before. And Marc mentioned that there are other groups that are working on this. Our idea is to actually piggyback and actually bring all of these groups together so we do know there is a GeoBIM initiative in Europe that's been running for a while. We know even in the United States, where I said, we have had efforts dating back more than a decade, that try to bring these things together. So I think we are not trying to reinvent the wheel. The idea is this is a point in time. I think it's a point of inflection where people don't care about where the data is. They want to connect it. And that's kind of the moment of urgency that we're seizing on. Second thing is we don't want to get bogged down we do want to tie it to standards where we can, and make sure that the standards move along. But we also want to be practical about solving problems because we have the tools today to actually solve these problems in a proprietary way. It'll be nice to do it in a standards-based way. And that's one of the things that will drive it. Although, we have to bring probably the standards development organizations and software vendors along the journey by giving them a direction, to say, this is what we need to solve as a priority. So I think that's kind of, the gist of this. So you will see a lot of the governance framework, the standards development framework, how to build data models modularly so we can actually connect the data sets, without having to bring it all together into one model. One thing that the roadmap has recognized is that there will be multiple representations of the real world. There'll be probably infinite number of representations depending on our perspective. The idea is that once we align on what data needs to be shared, it may be that much easier to share so we can bring all the community along. So you'll see the metadata modeling standards, the open data modeling standards, all of that baked into this work plan. But every action will be starting with a user story and a use case associated with the user story. So I think that's kind of the outline. I won't go through every step of this, but just know that, we are a practice-oriented roadmap. We want to have the energy of the user story behind any action we take, whether it's in a standards body or whether it's in a software forum, trying to bring these tools and technologies together. So we will have a training component. The idea is that once we identify a problem, let's say permitting, we solve that problem, and we have software tools available. And so that would be a win. And then we go on to the next problem. So that's kind of the agile cycle that we're thinking about. Many people contributed to this roadmap. You'll see some names in the report that I'll allude to. So Marc, I think as we go through this, we'll discover so once this roadmap, now that it is published, we had this outreach session in Valencia, and I'll let Erik go through, what some of the reactions were from Valencia, and then I'll come back in and talk to you about, what the next steps are for the roadmap. Go ahead.
So as I said here, Erik, if you want to talk to, this was data that we collected as we presented 3 different sort of categories of BIM and GIS interoperability potential, and 3 stories, 3 use cases, 3 scenarios within each one of those. We collected feedback from an audience of about 100 attendees. So you want to talk through these, Erik?
Yep. Thanks. And I echo Marc and Jag's thanks to the attendees and to buildingSMART for hosting this. I think it's important to keep the momentum going as we head also towards Marrakesh and subsequent summits. So as you were saying, today we'll be revisiting these scenarios. So we'll be able to have a bit more information for the attendees that weren't maybe with us in Valencia. It's a bit of a repeat for those that were. But I think it was also important to give feedback and say like, how are we going to be using this data, as Jag was saying, within the roadmap to start formalizing and moving the needle forward in a structured fashion. So in these 3 sort of types of interactions between GIS and BIM, when we looked at, as Marc was saying, we had people actually come to and rate the desirability and the feasibility of each of these scenarios, and then speak to in a very broad sense, how do they envision these scenarios? So the data we collected was actually open. We didn't want to constrain. So what we did after was actually come back and analyze the results, and we'll do something very similar today. So you see examples here of what we got, and we asked the question around which domain do you most associate with, or if you belong to a domain or participate in a domain in buildingSMART. What are your perspectives on these types of scenarios? So if we give an example, then we were able to look at them across domains. And of course, there's many layers of analysis to be done yet. But today we just wanted to give some feedback, show that people in Valencia that we're actually taking this into account. And we started in analyzing across 3 layers around purpose, what was deemed sort of an input, and what's sort of deemed as an outcome. So if I look at, for example, outcomes around large-scale developments, and we can debate, in terms of is that purpose and outcome and so forth. Purposes and outcomes are directly tied. But for instance, stakeholder involvement as a purpose or as an outcome, well, we saw it in both emerge as a specific intention around BIM, GIS into BIM for large-scale development, both at the airport level and the construction level. And we saw in the buildings domain, for instance, there was just to say in terms of statistically, we had a large representation of infrastructure domain people. So I think actually a third of all participants were in the infrastructure domain at the summit, and today we'll see which domain you belong to. But we saw sort of different perspectives here. So for instance, in this case, for large-scale development in terms of expected outcomes, transparency and ease of communication with the authorities. Again, well, this is ties to stakeholder communication, validation of building placement, for railway communications with neighbors and politicians. So again, stakeholder involvement, so visualization. So that was for large-scale development, and we'll be able to share the outcomes as we analyze them a bit more in depth. If we look at BIM into GIS, again, three scenarios that were ranked in terms of feasibility, how much effort and how desirable they were, and urban planning came out on top, sort of the low-hanging fruit, as I think Jag likes to put it. So in terms of urban planning, we'll revisit the scenario. But in terms of purpose, for instance, airports, of course, which are cities unto themselves, interfacing future developments and master plans. So again, how does that happen? How do we develop the exchanges, the transactions? How do we formalize them in a buildingSMART sort of ecosystem, in a GIS, OGC ecosystem? How do those things speak to each other? Looking at in construction, community building comparisons, spatial georeferenced analysis. We're seeing a lot of use around GIS for excavation and transport, et cetera, et cetera. So if we can continue with urban planning to inputs. So this again, as we move ahead, as we start targeting very specific scenarios and their subsequent use cases, we'll be able to start, of course, identifying requirements. This will then speak to services such as information delivery specifications, such as the buildingSMART data dictionary, such as services offered by in the GIS domain to really rally these two communities behind these efforts. If we continue outcomes, so urban planning, of course, a lot of this spoke to the buildings sector, the buildings domain a bit more, looking at, again, interactions with citizens, improving the permitting process, looking at sight lines, proactive zoning, and so forth. So these are, we're now detailing more and more of those scenarios. And if you go to the last one, Marc, which we'll be able to, again, revisit today, looking at the blurring the lines between BIM and GIS, A lot of interest, I think, around. You see, these are clustered very close, so there wasn't any clear winner. We took the most the highest ranked. So in this case, digital as built. Here we have again, capturing as built conditions across construction phases at multiple scales in the buildings domain. Again, transportation in terms of purpose. Looking at looking at augmented reality with inspections and so forth. In terms of purpose, if we go to input, using GIS maps, 3D as external references, and BIM authoring tools. So we're trying to get into this details of what is needed, what are the elements that are required to support these use cases and these scenarios. And if we go to the last one around outcomes, of course, historical findable records. These are closely tied to what we expect the as-builts to be. But here we're looking at as-built across scales for campuses, for large, for instance, municipalities that have multiple buildings, different types of equipment, perhaps the same equipment in different buildings on a large scale. Are these the types of things that we can start looking at planning, maintenance, and being more efficient in those types of elements? So that's a recap. I think what was important was to show that we are taking all this feedback into account. We hope that everybody on the call will be able to participate. We're giving ourselves a lot of time to get that feedback through Menti, and we encourage you all to shoot us your ideas. So that's me. Thank you.
Jag, you want to talk a little bit about the recently published BSIOG?
Sure. Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Mark and Erik. Wonderful recap there. I think definitely, I resonated with those 3 use cases. I think there may be some, I think Erik said it, and I love the word low-hanging fruit. Certainly, maybe there is a little bit of a finessing and massaging of words, because different things mean different, words mean different things to different industries. Like we say, digital as-built, some people may say asset and operations handoff within the buildingSMART community or something like that. So I think we do need to work on the language, but I think the idea of that exchange, going in from the very detailed scale information from a BIM perspective as the project is going through design construction, to maybe situating it in a broader scale to ensure, a broader geographic scale, where the building or a facility lives, to understand the connections with the topography and environmental factors. I think that'll be, as you hand it off, that's the domain it might enter sometimes. Sometimes it may just be in that highly detailed scale of modeling. But whatever the case is, I think we'll figure out the terms and we'll advance it. As I mentioned earlier, I think there is this roadmap that's now published, and you might want to just please scan this. There's a QR code. It's now an official document. The objectives of the roadmap, just recap. And as Erik was going through, I was just reflecting back on the objectives really are to solve impactful use cases. As I mentioned, the high priority ones, provide those standardized toolkits to advance those use cases in real world applications through software applications that we have today. Demonstrate the advantages actually doing this using open standards, educating a new generation of data suppliers and data users on how to be simultaneously adept at enterprise scale, BIM and GIS data connections, and then engage the traditionally siloed communities. Really is to start thinking broadly. We are not BIM people or GIS people. We are simply data people, and that's kind of the awareness that we want to build. So hopefully you'll find the read interesting. So what are the next steps for this roadmap? As I mentioned, we are starting to socialize this. We're trying to start collecting stories. So how do we go about doing that? I think we do have a plan, and I think the plan right now focuses on tapping into, first of all, publishing the roadmap. We have accomplished that. The next one is to develop a steering committee for to take forward the roadmap activities. I'll dwell a little bit on that. And then once we form the steering committee, then we'll reissue a call. Actually, we had a call for pilots about 3 years ago. I think we're going to reissue it with new energy call for pilots, which means, we're now getting people who have the need to connect this data engaged in solving their real world problems. So we'll prioritize those problems and issue a call for pilots. Hopefully many can participate in that, and then start doing the work of the roadmap, standardizing the data modeling and getting it into software applications and releasing those toolkits. So in terms of steering committee, so I do want to mention this is, we are trying to tap into the buildingSMART and OGC domains specifically because they are within reach. You're part of the buildingSMART membership group. If you're interested, and if you're in any one of these domains, or maybe even outside, the idea is that we'll tap into these domains to extract user stories so we can build those higher order use cases. As Marc said, he's the leader currently and our head for the infrastructure domain to get the user stories surfaced. And he's doing an amazing job already trying to collect that. So if you're in the infrastructure domain, you have Marc as your leader. We're trying to work within the buildingSMART community to appoint a point person from within those domains or tech rooms to to be the kind of our touch point, in terms of surfacing the user stories and the connections that BIM and GIS need to have from those. Those are yet to be done. Those appointments are yet to be made, but we expect that. I think Erik mentioned the road to Marrakesh. Marrakesh is where the next buildingSMART Summit is, for those of you, some of you already know that. We want to get to that point where we do have appointed heads and leads for these committees, like Marc, in each of these domains, and they will be part of the joint working group. We'll do the same thing on the other side. So if you go to the next one, OGC has already identified from among their number of several working groups, a number of them that will feed the same user stories and be the touch points for their communities. So specifically, if you're on the OGC side, and if you're in any one of these working groups, whether it is the 3D Information Management Working Group, Urban Digital Twins Working Group, City GML Standards Working Group, or the Land Infra Working Group, you are in business, because we'll have a lead liaison appointed there, and those in the community can work with that liaison to get your ideas out there. We need your ideas. We hope you can be part of this community. The third leg of this is, I think while we're doing this between the buildingSMART and OGC communities, there is also, I think we're fortunate to have Erik here, who is on the ISO committees structure, which is looking at the geospatial data modeling, GIS, BIM interoperability, and built asset modeling committees. These are separate technical committees and work groups. I think Erik is our liaison there. I think we had a meeting with them, and while they look more on the standardization side, they are very interested in keeping in touch with this. So again, we are also covering that base, hopefully, as we engage over the next 3 years. So it's very exciting. And so again, I just want to point out that if you are in those committees, in those of buildingSMART and OGC, and you want to be a part of this, please raise your hand. We'll have formal appointments announced. We'll have a joint working group hopefully in place by the time we get to Marrakesh. And we'll have the first meeting, around the stories we're collecting up until that point, priority use cases, and then, looking at the committee structure and what we should do to issue that call for pilots, going forward. So, Marc, I think that's all I had on this.
Let me jump in there. Yeah, I mean, to recap what Erik showed there, all of those bullet points and those various columns associated with the 3 different ways in which GIS and BIM might come together. We collected nearly 100 points of feedback against those stories and those use cases which we presented. And our intention is to do the same today. In person, the dynamic was a little bit different versus here on a Zoom meeting, but we will be presenting those same 3 high-level topics, and within those, we will be showing 3 specific stories. So 9 stories altogether, and using Menti again to understand who you are, first of all. So if you could go to menti.com and type in this code, or on your phone, capture the QR code, which will allow us to do that cross-tabulation between what area of interest you have as it pertains to the buildingSMART domains. And then as we collect information about the various workflows and give you an opportunity to provide some feedback, we'll again be able to cross-tabulate that. So if you can take a minute and go to the menti.com. And again, the code is up at the top. The QR code is also available for you to take a picture of. This was actually an image from Valencia where we used buildingSMART colored and branded Uno cards as a way of gathering sort of qualitative feedback on what topics were of interest. And you can see people holding up different cards to represent their level of interest. And then we would go to Menti to collect the more quantitative and detailed points of feedback. So first off, we want to know who you are. We want to know what domain you most closely associate yourself, and it might be more than one, but which one would you most closely associate the work you do, whether or not you are active in any of these buildingSMART domains. Again, this will help us with cross-tabulating to understand when your feedback comes in against which group it should be associated. So, I know we've got a few more than 8, 10, 12 people here, a couple thumbs up. And I also saw a chat come in seeking participation. So thank you. Use the chat window as well. Zoom meetings are a little bit distant and not so dynamic as when we get together in person. So please use the chat to send us any questions or feedback. This is interesting to see. When we were together in Valencia, the majority of the attendees were from infrastructure. It looks like we've got a larger majority from the building domain in this call. So please keep filling this out. Please send us your chats and let us know who you are as we're now about to go into some of the topics and categories here. So, first of all, BIM and GIS. I mean, BIM has become a standard of practice, certainly within the construction industry, the architecture, engineering, whether vertical or horizontal. Jag and Erik, do you guys want to maybe just talk, a little bit about just kind of frame the ongoing importance of BIM?
Well, the last time we switched, and it was interesting because you belong to a specific domain. I'm a trained architect and have worked in architecture for 15 years, so definitely more a buildings person. And we do call upon spatial data for very specific reasons. But of course, the importance of BIM, I think it's now no longer a debate. Now it's more a question of, well, how do we do it? How fast do we do it? And to what extent? What's the scope to which we do this? One thing that I think it's becoming interesting in the conversations and investing into the GIS domains and is how these domains sort of look at relate to data. And I think the BIM is, of course, we know it. There's a massive potential. We're seeing mandates around the world. Owners really embrace it to look at a life cycle perspective on their assets. But really, where I see the connection points and where the migration happening within the BIM domain, if we want to call it that, is this shift in mindset from a file-based, paper-based approach to a data approach. And it's when you speak to GIS people, they've been there for the past 30 years. So there's this shift happening where I think we're keying into what's happening in what has happened in the GIS domain for so long, and then seeing, what are these rules and how do they apply to our domain? And this conversation, this notion of data at scale is really helping us, I think, in our domain, in BIM, migrate towards a more data-centric approach. So the importance of BIM now is really, I think, for us as a field, as a domain in terms of the built asset industry related to specific assets, is this recognition of the importance of data.
Right. I think, Erik, well put there. It's the lines are blurring, aren't they? Because I think you mentioned something. It is about spatial data. Actually, today in the tooling, there is really no difference when it comes to spatial data representation, between a BIM tool and a GIS tool. There shouldn't be any, So essentially, I think I credit Erik for the title of that roadmap. The continuity of data modeling is really the key part, and we were struggling with what title. Is it integration? Is it whatever? I think it's really about continuity. So where the difference is, I think we do, and I think you correctly mentioned when you talk to GIS people, that we've been there, we've been having sophisticated systems, platforms, data migration, data connection, APIs. We've been playing in that world for a very, very long time. So the real difference is really in the scale, right? I mean, it comes to the granularity of data and information, in a specific BIM tool, maybe at a smaller scale than the vast geographic scale of the same spatial and geographical data that is a bigger scale of spatial data that GIS hosts, plus it adds the geographical data context to it. And therefore, it can range from local to global in terms of the scale and type of information that can be included. Think about topographical data, environmental data. I think I alluded to this before. When it comes to infrastructure data, now you can play with the scale a little bit more. Demographic data, social data, all of that is generally available in GIS, and that's becoming more and more useful in doing the analysis that we are all seeking to do, whether it's a impact of a building, impact of infrastructure, impact on emissions, water bodies, everything that we live, impact on societies, of a built infrastructure. All of that is possible when you can move the data across and move the data across different scales to actualize the right use cases. So it's really almost seamless, except, I think we're playing with scale. And this roadmap does recognize that multiple representation and the level of detail and information that's contained in both models, while recognizing that at the base, we are talking about really about the scale of information, and that may be needed in some contexts, a smaller scale or granular scale versus a larger scale. So it's really about making that exchange effective to actually actualize the outcomes that we're after. So really not a huge difference between the two as far as the spatial breakdown structures is concerned in terms of data modeling, and more tools are recognizing this. So I think I think this importance is being realized at a larger scale, and that's really why we are here. It's really that recognition that the tools are providing us that data at the right scale, and the trick will be now to make sure that we capture the right type of data, in terms of objects, properties, and align them so that the tooling can work more efficiently rather than having a point-to-point integration between two applications. So thank you for that.
Term you used, JAG scale. I'm actually at, like I said, at the National Institute of Building Sciences conference, and earlier this morning moderated a discussion that included folks from Digital Twin Consortium, buildingSMART US, as well as NIBS, on the topic of BIM and digital twins, more so than GIS. But I think that the issue of scalability, as we discussed this morning in this panel discussion, applies here as well. Scale is certainly the size of the project. BIM tends to be a single capital asset. It might be a room, a space, a building, maybe a campus, and digital twins and GIS both tend to be a larger scale from that geographic point of view. But GIS also is broader in scale in the accessibility and the number of stakeholders who tend to access GIS information. Those who are using BIM authoring tools or consuming BIM data tend to be a group of professionals, accredited, very specific tasks associated with planning, designing, and building a structure. Whereas GIS gets into the hands of decision makers and policymakers and end users who are consuming information much more so than that BIM content. So scalability, not just in the size of the project, but scalability in delivering information to a much broader audience over a longer life cycle is also an element of scalability that came.
And the types. I think if I can just put one word, it's also the types of information, right? I think it's that scalability in terms of that and connecting the two types together, for analysis. Yeah.
And as it says here, together they amplify the value of each other's data. A GIS environment comprised of BIM information that can be visualized and analyzed adds more value to that BIM information. In GIS, whether it's a 2D or 3D map with demographics or traffic flow or weather patterns as an underlay to BIM information, helps with the design, the engineering, the connectivity of that building to the broader context. So they should work hand in glove, and they're starting to. but like we said, it's been point-to-point solutions, proprietary files coming into proprietary applications, and the need is to open that up to openBIM and more OpenGIS. So in this first of three categories, GIS into BIM solutions, BIM applications, these are going to be, these next few images and slides are going to be the three topics we talked about in Valencia, and that we're continuing to build momentum around and getting additional details so those stories can be fleshed out and eventually pilots be developed. So as we did in Valencia, we talked about this kind of limited scope design development, a single building, a parking garage on an existing site, a singular off-ramp or a small part of a transportation corridor being limited scope design development. And there's certainly benefits of GIS information, GIS layers, GIS visualizations coming into a BIM application, a BIM authoring tool, a BIM viewing tool to provide context, to provide those types of information that you typically wouldn't see in the process of laying out your lines, arcs, and circles that make up a built structure. Jagger, Eric, you want to elaborate on anything there before I move on to the next one?
You stated it perfectly. Thanks.
Okay. Another use of, again, GIS being the underlay, the context of a BIM environment is larger scale development. An entire corridor, a subdivision, an entire campus, the design process, the engineering process, bringing GIS into those tools helps with those grander scale meta design decisions that are critical if you are planning on engineering or developing something that potentially impacts an entire community, an entire city, if not even larger than that. Understanding the utility networks, the hydrology and the hydraulic data, the water tables, the community asset information, the demographics, those types of data sets being visualized and understood as you're determining where your corridors are going to go or where a new building is going to be placed. To make those decisions without this data, in some ways, I hate to be, exaggerate, but it is almost malpractice. If you had that data available to you and yet you're making decisions without considering it, your likelihood of making some uninformed decisions is so great. So if you could bring together that context into the engineering, design, and documentation tools, why would you not? And then thirdly, in this category of GIS into BIM, gets into some of the places where GIS is not necessarily always considered, but the amount of data related to underground subsurface conditions is vast. Whether it's again the water tables or utilities or geotechnical information of ground conditions that are generated through borehole digging and then visualized typically in GIS, again brought into a modeling environment to plan construction, to plan where buildings might go, to plan where transportation corridors should best be placed to minimize the amount of engineering that has to take place. Again, why would you not bring these two together using the most open methods if you could? So with that sort of introduction of three different BIM into GIS workflows, I want you to jump over to Menti again, and going to give you an opportunity to weigh in on these three scenarios, these three topics where GIS becomes the context in a BIM environment. Hopefully you still have Menti up and running, or menti.com, and you can just type in the code here. We're going to ask you to weigh in on where the working groups should focus. Is there a particular element of these two types of data and types of applications should invest time and energy and resources and perhaps pilot projects, as Jag mentioned, as part of the roadmap? Where should these resources continue to identify details to get these pilots up and running? And no real surprise, this was similar to the way in Valencia the feedback came in. I think it's just by the very nature of GIS being strong at larger scale development, or perceived to be, and the value of that information on larger scale projects. So appreciate the voting here. And again, no real surprise, would like you to do next is give us some story details, give us some particular context, some types of projects, some examples where again, we can comb through your feedback, associate them with the domain that you represent, and just put some more meat on the bones, if you will, to the user story concepts that have been developed so that these pilot projects can be identified, the particular type of project, large scale development. Is it a particular campus challenge, or is it connecting the utilities like I mentioned, or is it, you know, subsurface geotechnical considerations where GIS and BIM, if they came together better, would add value to the industry, would add value to your work. So hopefully you are typing out your connectivity stories, your data challenges, and scroll down if you're doing this on your phone and you have to hit the submit button. So hopefully we get some responses.
Maybe Mark, if so while we can get people to fill this out and go back to the presentation, given the fact that we're 12 minutes out. But one thing that's interesting is that we're seeing is also that you know, organizations, and I'll speak to the City of Montreal, for instance, that have you know, the geomatics group have been very active and very proficient over the past couple of decades, and now they're seeing developing their capabilities around you know, subterranean infrastructure modeling. And it's now part of the requirements that before you close out a street, you have to position each asset, each conduit with a certified professional, and then they have that data, the location data, the type, and everything that they're able to build out their subterranean model for the city. And of course, this is a long-term plan, because you know, we're not digging the whole city up, but at least they're building the database. And now you're going to see, you know, having access in open data formats and to these subterranean models, and then that will be able to inform future work and better planning of. That's one big issue here is, you know, you dig a conduit and you install a conduit one year, and the year after another service comes in and digs the same place, and then the year after. So this notion of actually enabling and helping municipalities better plan and locate their assets, and then have them at both the asset scale but at the territorial scale, I think is super important and interesting.
Yeah, I think Mark, if I can, just to add, again, I think we are coming at this problem from a multi-domain perspective. So as you're thinking about it, you know, regardless of where you are, you know, you can connect to the issue that Erik raised, because I'm from the infrastructure domain. I can say we have a very mature field called subsurface utility engineering. When you look at road infrastructure and you dig, you know, and you bury, you know, because those utilities are not managed by the road authority. Typically, it's managed by a utility company. Now there's requirements in place to locate them, have the BIM level, if I can get the granular level of data associated with those utilities before they close it up. So the next project, you know, doesn't have to strike a gas line as you're digging through. So I think it's very relatable, Erik. I just wanted to jump in there because it gives context to the people we're asking to provide input. So it's really the story. The story is really making sure that we have locates correctly and we have the right level of detail. You know, that's essentially the story. And then we bubble up to this bigger problem of subterranean modeling for urban planning. You know, that's basically what we're trying to solve here. So just wanted to chime in from my perspective. So it's a very hot topic.
And just, you know, again, in the spirit of time here, the other category that we went into, so first it was GIS being an underlay to BIM to help in those BIM authoring tools. Second here is BIM information coming into a GIS application, which is probably a little bit less familiar to a buildingSMART community. buildingSMART community is going to be more well-versed in the BIM authoring tools, most likely, than the GIS applications. But, you know, I know coming from Esri, the ability to bring in IFC files, bring in Revit files, bring in files from Vectorworks, from Bentley, from various other BIM authoring tools into the GIS environment certainly feeds the workflows around urban planning. So we'll just skip through that. Operations and maintenance. The richness of a BIM authoring tool with precise geometry, with properties that have been added to the model through the planning, designing, engineering, and even the construction process, to be able to put that into an environment where you can spatially analyze or connect your GIS environment to ERP systems or other facilities management applications, operations and maintenance, just adds more value to the BIM information that was invested in it. It justifies the work of the architects and engineers and construction professionals to enrich their BIM model, knowing that it's not going to hit a dead end, but that GIS becomes this means of delivering more capabilities and extending the accessibility and the value of that BIM information. GIS simply does things differently, more at a data-centric level than the file-based approach that BIM has been at for the last few decades. And complementary to operations maintenance is facility management. So whether that's space planning, wayfinding, asset finding, again, the combination of the two, the richness of BIM, the details of BIM, the asset-centric approach of BIM in a GIS application is just opening the door to extending the value, more people gaining access to the information, and justifying the BIM investment in some cases. So back over to Menti. Great to see that we had a few responses to the last question. Thank you for continuing to add some responses to that first one. So BIM into GIS, just as we were saying, would like you to again vote here. Where should the working groups, whether within buildingSMART and OGC, the efforts that NIBS is taking on, Digital Twin Consortium, various groups that are looking at BIM and GIS coming together, when BIM is a layer in a GIS environment, of these three particular scenarios, which ones would be most interesting to the attendees here, to the industry, if you can represent that perspective, so that again these groups know where to identify pilots and where the effort should be applied versus spread across many areas. And I don't recall exactly, and maybe it doesn't really even matter, where in Valencia the interest laid, but it's interesting to see that operations maintenance, facilities management, which are so closely related. Urban planning just bumped up again. So
urban planning came out on top.
Yeah, it did as I was talking. But no, I think it's somewhat indicative of who the audience is.
I think the operations and maintenance is interesting on when you're looking at owners that have assets that are spread across a large territory. Like Department of National Defense, it's the largest in Canada, is the largest building owner, and they have bases in Alert, in the Arctic, they have on the West Coast, East Coast, and so you can imagine how for them having equipment that's distributed, and how do you maintain that? How do you optimize maintenance routes and make sure that the equipments and expendables and are in place and everything? I think that's where it makes sense to have this territorial view of assets, and you're also looking at airports, landing strips, road networks on military bases. So these are the types of owners or even ministries of transports that have bridges that are assets versus within a road network. Being able to really iterate between those levels, as Jag was saying, around granularity, is going to be key and very valuable.
A question came in from Jonathan Bailey. How are you distinguishing between O&M and facilities management? Yeah, we spent a fair bit of time in Valencia. We had a 90-minute session versus the 60 minutes, and we did discuss that a little bit more. And I think we had clarity just from our conversation. So when people did vote, there was a clear understanding of where the line was between the two. Facilities management had more to do with things like lease management and space planning and allocation of physical assets that might be movable and necessary across a facility, versus operations maintenance, which was more about the ongoing maintenance of the assets, the building controls, the physical structures, the work orders that went into keeping a facility or a utility or a transportation network up and running, versus the other task sites that had more of a spatial element to them. But it's a good question that we just don't have time for, unfortunately, with only 4 minutes left here. I'll keep this slide open here, but I'm going to jump over to the last bit. Please add your connectivity stories, your anecdotes, your perspective on where BIM becoming a layer added to GIS can serve you, the industry, your customers. If you're a software vendor, where you might find value in bringing content from perhaps the BIM authoring and viewing and analysis application that you represent being available in a GIS view. So I'll just keep this slide up and running and ask you to continue to type out and submit your content that can contribute to these BIM into GIS scenarios. And then finally, with the last few minutes here, BIM and GIS, that there definitely is a blurring. Jag touched on it. Erik certainly did. I see it on a regular basis, where the BIM and GIS information, might predominantly be in one application, but the workflows to generate the BIM and feed it with GIS information that leads to better BIM that then makes its way into a GIS dashboard or an application out in the field that is then BIM and GIS combined and data being collected and going back into the BIM. I mean, there's really a blurring between the two. I've actually gotten into some heated arguments at Esri that in some ways our GIS applications are BIM viewing tools, are BIM analytics applications. So it isn't always a clean-cut line. One of the best examples, sort of where the rubber meets the road, if you will, is the idea of model as a legal document and the federated nature of the data that's coming in and the various applications that engineers and owners, DOTs, local authorities, the construction companies themselves bidding on a model-based approach. BIM and GIS are certainly blurred and coming together to serve that workflow. Construction collaboration as well. Out in the field, having that GIS context, which might be your utility information. It might be understanding your project plan instead of in a traditional work breakdown structure CPM schedule, but actually being location-based, or drone data, which is collected and combined with the BIM, allowing you to peel back the layers and understand before you're about to put the cladding on the building, what took place a few weeks before in the context of satellite imagery, airplane imagery, BIM imagery, utilities underground, and even weather patterns, let's say. So these merging together into singular dashboards, multiple dashboards is becoming quite common. And then finally, digital as-builts. Erik, you touched on this, and what immediately came to mind when you talked about the I don't know if it was Department of Defense that you mentioned. Information simply dropping in like a puzzle piece, that the BIM information being geolocated and GIS ready to be brought into a complete environment where everything is understood, the BIM, the CAD, the GIS, the sensors reporting on existing conditions, is probably the greatest example of this merging together of BIM and GIS delivering value in the form of, I'll use the buzzword digital twin. So once again, going to ask you to go over to Menti. Thank you for providing some thoughts on the last topic. And here we are, BIM and GIS blurring the lines. The concept of model as a legal document, construction collaboration, or delivering digital as-built along with the physical structure itself, more than as-built being PDFs that are marked up to hopefully represent what got built, but truly a digital representation that can be analyzed and visualized and used for facilities management, operations, and maintenance, where when you're in BIM and when you're in GIS and when you're in a field-based tool and when you're collecting data, again, become quite merged together and the lines are blurred. So again, no surprise that digital as-built was the most interesting. And I know we're over by a minute or so here, but I'm going to keep this slide here and ask for, again, any of your stories, any of your anecdotes, any of your examples where we can, push the effort towards particular pilots to help address the challenges that you're seeing, would be, very valuable to the working groups who are, working on the roadmap and going from evangelizing the importance of BIM and GIS to actually getting user stories and potentially pilot projects that then lead us to having APIs that software vendors can take advantage of. Question to come up. Does any GIS platform already exist that supports BIM? I can speak from the Esri point of view, definitely. We bring in IFC files all the way up to 4.3. We do also bring in Revit files, DWG files. We bring in DGN through a third party. And other BIM content, I'll stop there. And I'm quite sure that Cesium as a GIS viewer also has capabilities of bringing in various BIM formats. I'm pretty sure IFC. Other companies, I couldn't talk to intelligently. And that's about it. I've got a URL here. I thought I had a QR code at one point that if you are interested in, continuing to be part of the conversation, to being, a participant in this effort to bring GIS and openBIM together, go to that URL, drop a note in the chat here, send Jag, myself, or Erik an email, find us on LinkedIn. Let us know. The more the merrier here, certainly. We've already got a great group of participants and contributors, but we can always use more voices. Jag,
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. All right.
Just a thank you from buildingSMART side to our speakers today, Marc, Jag, and Erik. Thank you for your time and presenting the updates on this roadmap. It's going to be exciting to see in October in Marrakesh the next stages of this. And thank you for participation of everyone on this session. So thank you, everyone, and we'll bring the session to a close.